The bystander effect. You might think that if you were in an emergency and surrounded by people, you'd be more likely to get help. But social psychology tells us that the opposite is often true. This is the bystander effect, a phenomenon where the presence of other people discourages an individual from intervening in an emergency situation. The more bystanders there are, the less likely it is that any one of them will help. This effect was brought to the forefront of psychological research following the tragic 1964 murder of a woman named Kitty Genovese in New York City. Newspaper reports at the time claimed that 38 witnesses saw or heard the attack but did not intervene or call the police. While the details of this story have been debated and somewhat exaggerated over the years, it sparked a wave of research into why people do or do not help in emergencies. Psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley conducted a series of experiments to understand this phenomenon. In one study, they had a participant sit in a room to fill out a questionnaire. Suddenly, smoke would start to pour into the room. When the participant was alone, they almost always reported the smoke to the experimenters. However, when the participant was in a room with two other people, who were actors told to ignore the smoke, they were far less likely to report it. So why does this happen? There are a couple of key psychological principles at play. The first is diffusion of responsibility. When you're the only one who witnesses an emergency, the responsibility to act is solely on you. But when there are other people around, that responsibility gets divided among everyone present. You might assume that someone else will step in, or that someone else is more qualified to help. The second principle is the need to behave in socially acceptable ways. In an ambiguous situation, we often look to others for cues on how to act. If you see an emergency and no one else is reacting, you might conclude that it's not actually an emergency, or that you'd be overreacting if you did something. This is a form of social influence. The bystander effect is a powerful reminder that our actions are often influenced by the people around us, sometimes in ways we don't even realize. It highlights the importance of being aware of this tendency so that we can overcome it and be more likely to help when someone is in need, even if we're in a crowd. The Dunning-Kruger effect. You've likely encountered the Dunning-Kruger effect, even if you didn't know its name. It's a cognitive bias where people with low ability in a specific area tend to overestimate their competence. This happens because the very skills needed to be good at something are the same skills required to recognize how good you are at it. So, if you're not skilled in a particular area, you also lack the ability to accurately assess your own lack of skill. This phenomenon was first described in 1999 by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger. In their studies, they tested participants on subjects like grammar, logical reasoning, and humor. They found that individuals who scored in the bottom quartile on these tests consistently and significantly overestimated their performance. For instance, participants who scored at the 12th percentile, on average, rated their own ability to be at the 62nd percentile. Dunning and Kruger called this a dual burden. Not only are these individuals incompetent, but their incompetence robs them of the mental ability to realize just how incompetent they are. You can see examples of this everywhere. Think of a driver with only a few months of experience who believes they're as skilled as someone who has been driving for years. In fact, around 80% of drivers rate themselves as above average, which is statistically impossible. This overconfidence can lead to risky decisions on the road. In the workplace, an employee might be confident they understand a new task and not ask for help, leading to preventable mistakes. We also see it in people who share strong political opinions on social media with very little understanding of the policies they're discussing. Interestingly, the Dunning-Kruger effect also suggests that, conversely, highly competent individuals tend to underestimate their own abilities. They may assume that tasks they find easy are just as easy for everyone else. It's important to remember that the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't about intelligence in general. A person can be highly skilled in one area and still be subject to this bias in another. The key takeaway is the importance of humility and self-awareness. To avoid falling into this trap, we can all make an effort to continuously learn, seek out constructive criticism from others, and challenge our own assumptions about what we think we know. Cognitive dissonance theory. You've probably experienced that uncomfortable feeling when your actions don't quite line up with your beliefs. That feeling has a name: cognitive dissonance. It's the mental stress you feel when you hold two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values, or when your beliefs are inconsistent with your actions. This theory was first proposed by psychologist Leon Festinger in the 1950s. The core idea is that we all have a fundamental need for our attitudes and behaviors to be in harmony. When they aren't, it creates a state of tension that we are motivated to reduce. A classic experiment that demonstrated this involved having participants perform a mind-numbingly boring task, turning pegs on a board for an hour. Afterwards, the participants were asked to lie to the next person waiting to do the experiment and tell them that the task was actually really interesting. Here's the catch: some participants were paid $1 to tell this lie, while others were paid $20. Later, when asked to rate how much they genuinely enjoyed the peg-turning task, the participants who were paid only $1 rated it as more enjoyable than those who were paid $20. Why? The participants who were paid $20 had a clear external justification for their lie: they did it for the money. But for the participants who were only paid a single dollar, there was a significant dissonance between their belief that the task was boring and their action of telling someone it was fun for such a small amount of money. To resolve this discomfort, they unconsciously changed their belief about the task, convincing themselves that it wasn't so bad after all. We see cognitive dissonance in our everyday lives all the time. Imagine a person who considers themselves an environmentalist but buys a gas-guzzling SUV. To reduce the dissonance, they might start to downplay the importance of fuel efficiency, telling themselves that the car's safety features for their family are more important, or that their individual car purchase won't make a big difference in the grand scheme of climate change. Another common example is buyer's remorse. After making a significant purchase, you might start to second-guess your decision and focus on the negative aspects of what you bought and the positive aspects of what you didn't choose. To reduce this dissonance, you'll likely seek out positive reviews of your purchase and try to convince yourself that you made the right choice. Conformity and groupthink. We all have a natural desire to fit in and be accepted by our social groups. This can lead to conformity, which is the act of matching our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors to the norms of a group. One of the most famous experiments on conformity was conducted by Solomon Asch in the 1950s. He wanted to see if people would conform to a group's wrong answer, even when the correct answer was obvious. In his experiment, a participant was placed in a room with several other people, who were all actors. They were shown a line and then asked to choose the matching line from a set of 3. The task was designed to be very easy. However, the actors were instructed to all give the same obviously wrong answer. Asch found that a significant number of the real participants conformed to the group's incorrect answer, even though they knew it was wrong. When interviewed later, many said they didn't want to go against the group and risk being seen as peculiar. This desire for group consensus can sometimes lead to a more dangerous phenomenon called groupthink. This term was coined by social psychologist Irving Janis in the 1970s. Groupthink occurs when a group of well-intentioned people make irrational or non-optimal decisions because of the urge to conform or the belief that dissent is impossible. The group becomes more focused on maintaining unity than on making the best decision. Some of the warning signs of groupthink include an illusion of invulnerability, where the group believes they can't fail. There's also a belief in the inherent morality of the group, which can lead them to ignore the ethical consequences of their decisions. Dissenting opinions are often suppressed, and there's pressure on group members to conform. A historical example that is often cited in relation to groupthink is the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. The decision to launch the shuttle was made despite warnings from engineers about the potential for O-ring failure in cold temperatures. The pressure to launch and the belief that NASA had a strong safety record may have contributed to a groupthink mentality that downplayed the risks. To avoid groupthink, it's important for groups to encourage open inquiry and for leaders to assign the role of devil's advocate to at least one member of the team. It's also crucial to create an environment where all members feel comfortable expressing their opinions without fear of being ostracized. The placebo effect. You've likely heard of the placebo effect, but its power can be truly remarkable. A placebo is any substance or treatment that has no therapeutic value but can still produce a real, measurable effect on a person's health. The effect itself is the phenomenon where a person experiences real improvements in their condition simply because they believe they are receiving legitimate treatment. In medical research, placebos are a crucial part of clinical trials. To test a new drug, for example, researchers will typically divide participants into two groups. One group receives the actual drug, while the other group receives a placebo, such as a sugar pill, that looks identical. This is often done in a double-blind study, where neither the participants nor the researchers know who is getting the real treatment and who is getting the placebo. This helps to ensure that the results are not influenced by the expectations of either party. The fascinating thing is that in many studies, a significant number of people in the placebo group report a reduction in their symptoms. These are not just imagined improvements, in some cases, there are measurable physiological changes. For example, people who are given a placebo for pain have been shown to have a release of endorphins, the body's natural painkillers. The placebo effect is not just about the power of positive thinking. The context in which the placebo is given can have a huge impact. For instance, studies have shown that a placebo pill that is more expensive is more effective than a cheaper one. 2 placebo pills are more effective than 1. And a placebo injection is more effective than a placebo pill. Even the color of the pill can make a difference, with blue pills often being associated with a calming effect and red pills with a stimulating one. The doctor-patient relationship also plays a significant role. If a doctor expresses confidence in a treatment, the placebo effect is likely to be stronger. The ritual of treatment itself, the consultation, the prescription, the act of taking a pill, can all contribute to the expectation of getting better. The placebo effect highlights the incredible connection between our minds and our bodies. It shows that our beliefs and expectations can have a profound impact on our physical health. While it's not a cure for all ailments, understanding the placebo effect is helping researchers to develop new ways to harness the power of the mind in healing. The halo effect. You've probably noticed that when you have a good first impression of someone, you tend to assume other good things about them. This is the halo effect. It's a cognitive bias where our overall impression of a person influences our feelings and thoughts about their specific traits. For instance, if you perceive someone as friendly or attractive, you're more likely to also see them as intelligent, competent, and trustworthy, even without any real evidence. The term was coined by psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920. The name comes from the religious art concept of a halo, which is painted over the heads of saints to show them as good and divine. In the same way, one positive quality can cast a halo over all other perceptions of a person. A classic example is how we often judge physically attractive people. This is sometimes called the "what is beautiful is also good" principle. We tend to assume attractive individuals have a wide range of positive qualities, which can lead to what's known as pretty privilege, societal advantages for those deemed attractive. This bias shows up in many real-world situations. In the classroom, teachers might unconsciously expect better performance from a well-behaved or attractive student, which can then influence how they interact with that student and even how they grade their work. In the workplace, a manager might give a glowing performance review to an employee who is enthusiastic and friendly, overlooking a lack of actual skills. The halo effect can even impact a person's income. Some studies have found that attractive individuals may earn more money because they are perceived as more capable. The opposite of the halo effect is the horns effect. This is when a negative first impression of one trait leads you to assume other negative things about a person. For example, if someone is late for a meeting, you might then perceive them as lazy or disrespectful in other areas as well. It's our mind's way of creating a consistent picture of people, even if it's based on limited information. Being aware of the halo effect can help us make more objective judgments, like when professors grade papers anonymously to avoid being influenced by their prior opinions of students. The Stanford Prison Experiment. You might have heard about the Stanford Prison Experiment as a dramatic example of how situations can shape human behavior. Conducted in August 1971 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University, the study aimed to see how quickly people would conform to the roles of guard and prisoner in a simulated prison environment. The experiment was supposed to last for 2 weeks but was shut down after just 6 days because of how extreme the situation had become. 24 male college students, who were screened and found to be psychologically healthy, were randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards. The prison was set up in the basement of the university's psychology building. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by real police officers, a surprise that was not part of the consent form they signed. They were then brought to the mock prison, stripped, and given uniforms with numbers to create a sense of de-individuation. The guards were given uniforms, billy clubs, and mirrored sunglasses to prevent eye contact. They were instructed not to use physical violence but were encouraged to create an atmosphere of oppression and powerlessness. What happened next was alarming. On only the second day, the prisoners staged a rebellion, which the guards quickly and forcefully put down. The guards began to display increasingly authoritarian and abusive behavior. They subjected the prisoners to humiliation, sleep deprivation, and arbitrary punishments. The prisoners, in turn, became passive, helpless, and some showed signs of extreme emotional distress. In fact, several prisoners had to be released from the experiment early due to severe emotional and psychological trauma. The experiment was terminated after Christina Maslach, a graduate student who was not involved in the study, voiced strong objections to the conditions she witnessed. For decades, the study was cited as powerful evidence of how easily ordinary people can do terrible things when put in the wrong situation. However, in recent years, the Stanford prison experiment has faced significant criticism. Critics have pointed out that the guards were given instructions on how to behave, which suggests their actions weren't entirely spontaneous. It's also been argued that the experiment had strong, demand characteristics, meaning the participants were likely behaving in the way they thought the researchers wanted them to. Despite these criticisms, the study remains a widely discussed and controversial topic in psychology. The Milgram Obedience Study. Imagine being asked to deliver increasingly painful electric shocks to another person simply because an authority figure in a lab coat told you to. This was the setup for the Milgram Obedience Study, one of the most famous and controversial experiments in psychology. Conducted by Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s, the study aimed to understand why people obey authority, even when it goes against their own conscience. Milgram was influenced by the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, who claimed he was just following orders. Milgram wanted to see if ordinary Americans would also obey immoral commands from an authority figure. Participants in the study were told they were taking part in an experiment on memory and learning. They were assigned the role of teacher, and were instructed to administer an electric shock to a learner, who was actually an actor, in another room every time the learner made a mistake on a word pair test. The shock generator had a series of switches that increased in 15-volt increments, up to a maximum of 450 volts. These switches were labeled with terms like slight shock, strong shock, and, at the highest levels, danger, severe shock. As the shocks increased, the actor would cry out in pain, complain of a heart condition, and eventually fall silent. If the teacher hesitated, the experimenter would use a series of prods, such as, "Please continue," or, "The experiment requires that you continue." Before the experiment, Milgram surveyed his colleagues, and they predicted that very few participants would go all the way to 450 volts. The results were shocking. In the most well-known version of the study, 65% of the participants administered the full 450-volt shock, and all participants went up to at least 300 volts. Many participants showed signs of extreme distress, such as sweating, trembling, and nervous laughter, yet they continued to obey the experimenter. The study has been widely criticized for its ethical issues, particularly the deception involved and the emotional stress it caused the participants. While Milgram did debrief the participants afterward, the experience was still very disturbing for many. Milgram conducted several variations of the experiment, finding that obedience levels dropped when the authority figure was not physically present or when the teacher was in the same room as the learner. Despite the ethical concerns, the Milgram study remains a powerful and unsettling demonstration of the human tendency to obey authority. The Pygmalion Effect. You've probably heard the term self-fulfilling prophecy. The Pygmalion Effect is a specific type of self-fulfilling prophecy where higher expectations placed upon people lead to an increase in their performance. The name comes from the Greek myth of Pygmalion, a sculptor who fell in love with a statue he carved, and the statue then came to life. The idea is that our beliefs about others can shape their behavior and, in a sense, bring those beliefs to life. This phenomenon was famously demonstrated in a 1968 study by Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson, which they detailed in their book Pygmalion in the Classroom. They went into an elementary school and gave students an IQ test. They then told the teachers that a certain group of students were intellectual bloomers, who were expected to show significant academic growth in the coming year. In reality, these students were chosen at random and had no special intellectual promise. When the researchers returned at the end of the school year and retested the students, they found that the randomly selected bloomers had, in fact, shown significantly greater IQ gains than their classmates. The teachers' expectations had become a reality. Rosenthal and Jacobson argued that the teachers likely gave more attention, encouragement, and challenging material to the students they believed were going to succeed. This, in turn, led those students to perform better. The Pygmalion effect can also work in the opposite direction, which is sometimes called the golem effect. Lower expectations can lead to worsened performance. The implications of the Pygmalion effect are huge, especially in education and the workplace. For teachers, it shows the powerful impact their beliefs about students can have on student achievement. Simply believing in a student's potential can be a catalyst for their success. In a professional setting, managers who have high expectations of their employees can often see those employees rise to the occasion. The key is that these expectations are often communicated in subtle, nonverbal ways, through body language, tone of voice, and the amount of feedback and opportunities given. The Pygmalion effect is a reminder that our expectations of others can be a powerful force in shaping who they become. The false memory phenomenon. You probably think of your memories as being like a video recording of your past, an accurate playback of events as they happened. But a large body of research in psychology shows that memory is far more malleable than we think. The false memory phenomenon is a case where people recall events that never actually happened, or they remember them differently from how they really occurred. Our memories are not static, they can be reconstructed and even manipulated by suggestion and misinformation. One of the leading researchers in this field is cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. She has conducted numerous studies demonstrating how easily false memories can be created. In one of her most famous experiments, known as the "lost in the mall" technique, she and her colleagues were able to implant a completely false memory into the minds of participants. They gave participants short narratives about their childhood, one of which was a fabricated story about being lost in a shopping mall. After being told this story, a significant number of participants not only came to believe it had happened but also added their own vivid details to the false memory. Another well-known study by Loftus involved showing participants a video of a car accident. Afterward, she asked them questions about what they saw. For some participants, she used the word "smashed" when asking about the cars, while for others she used the word "hit." The participants who heard the word "smashed" were more likely to later report that they saw broken glass in the video, even though there was none. This is an example of the misinformation effect, where exposure to misleading information after an event can alter our memory of the event itself. The research on false memories has had major implications, particularly in the legal system. Eyewitness testimony was once considered to be highly reliable, but Loftus's work has shown that it can be surprisingly inaccurate. The way a lawyer or a police officer asks a question can unintentionally influence a witness's memory. This has led to a greater understanding of the need for caution when relying on memory in legal cases. The false memory phenomenon is a powerful reminder that our memories are not perfect recordings of the past but are instead reconstructive processes that are susceptible to error and suggestion. Flow state. You've likely experienced a time when you were so completely absorbed in what you were doing that the rest of the world just seemed to fade away. That feeling is what psychologists call a flow state, or being in the zone. The concept was first described by psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who noticed that people are at their happiest not when they're relaxing, but when they're deeply engaged in a challenging activity. So, what does it feel like to be in a state of flow? It's characterized by a few key things. First, you have intense and focused concentration on the present moment. Your mind's usual chatter quiets down, and you're not distracted by anything else. Another hallmark is a merging of action and awareness. You feel at one with what you're doing, and your actions seem to happen effortlessly, almost automatically. You also experience a loss of self-consciousness, meaning you stop worrying about what others think of you or second-guessing yourself. One of the most common experiences during flow is a distorted sense of time. Hours can feel like minutes, or minutes can seem to stretch out. The activity also feels intrinsically rewarding. You're doing it for the sheer enjoyment of the process, not for some external prize. You can't force yourself into a flow state, but you can create the right conditions for it to happen. A crucial element is finding a balance between the challenge of the task and your own skill level. If the task is too easy, you'll get bored. If it's too difficult, you'll become anxious and frustrated. The sweet spot is when the activity pushes you to the edge of your abilities without being overwhelming. It's also important to have clear goals and to receive immediate feedback on your progress, so you can adjust your actions as you go. Finally, minimizing distractions is key. This could mean turning off your phone notifications or finding a quiet workspace. The Scarcity Principle. You've probably felt its pull before. You see that a product is a limited edition, or that a sale is ending in a few hours, and suddenly you want it more. This is the scarcity principle at work. It's a psychological phenomenon where we place a higher value on things that are in short supply. The idea is simple: opportunities seem more valuable to us when their availability is limited. There are a few reasons why scarcity has such a powerful effect on us. One is that we often use an item's availability as a mental shortcut to judge its quality. If something is rare or hard to get, we tend to assume it must be good. Another key driver is the fear of missing out, or FOMO. The thought of losing an opportunity can trigger a sense of urgency and anxiety, pushing us to act quickly so we don't regret it later. This is closely related to a concept called psychological reactance. When our freedom to choose something is threatened or limited, we have a strong desire to regain that freedom, which often means wanting the restricted item even more. Marketers use the scarcity principle in a number of ways. Limited time offers, like flash sales with a countdown timer, create a sense of urgency. Limited quantity tactics, such as releasing a small batch of a new sneaker, make the product feel exclusive and more desirable. You see this with travel websites that show only 2 rooms left at this price, or online retailers that display how many people are currently viewing an item. Scarcity doesn't just apply to products, it can also affect our perception of time. One study, known as the Good Samaritan experiment, found that people are less likely to help someone in need when they feel like they are in a hurry. This suggests that a perceived scarcity of time can even reduce our empathy for others. The scarcity principle is a powerful motivator that can sometimes lead us to make emotional and impulsive decisions. Loss aversion theory. You might think that finding $100 would feel just as good as losing $100 feels bad. But for most of us, that's not the case. This is because of a cognitive bias known as loss aversion. At its core, loss aversion is the idea that the pain of losing something is psychologically about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. This concept is a cornerstone of behavioral economics. Loss aversion shouldn't be confused with risk aversion. Risk aversion is a more general preference for a certain outcome over an uncertain one, even if the expected value is the same. Loss aversion, on the other hand, describes how we feel about gains and losses differently, and it can lead to both risk-averse and risk-seeking behavior. Here's how that plays out: because we dislike losses so much, we tend to be risk-averse when it comes to protecting our gains. For example, an investor might be quick to sell a stock that has gone up in value to lock in the profit, even if there's a good chance it could go up even more. But when it comes to our losses, we can actually become risk-seeking. That same investor might hold on to a losing stock for far too long, hoping it will recover, because selling it would mean having to accept the loss. You see this in marketing all the time. A "don't miss out on 20% off" message is often more effective than "save 20%. The first frames the discount as avoiding a loss, which is a stronger motivator. Loss aversion helps to explain a lot of our seemingly irrational financial decisions, and it's a powerful reminder of how much our emotions can influence our choices. Prospect theory. You might assume that when we make decisions involving risk, we do it in a rational way, carefully weighing the probabilities and choosing the option with the highest expected value. But in the 1970s, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky showed that's often not the case. They developed prospect theory, which describes how we actually make decisions under uncertainty, and it earned Kahneman a Nobel Prize in economics. Prospect theory has a few key ideas. The first is that we evaluate outcomes in terms of gains and losses relative to a reference point, which is usually our current situation or the status quo. This is different from traditional economic theories, which assume we look at the final outcome in absolute terms. The second idea is loss aversion, which we've just discussed. The value function in prospect theory is S-shaped and asymmetrical, steeper for losses than for gains. This means that a loss has a bigger emotional impact than a gain of the same size. Finally, prospect theory says that we don't treat probabilities in a linear way. We tend to overweight small probabilities, which helps explain why we buy lottery tickets, a small chance of a big win, and insurance, a small chance of a big loss. These principles lead to what's known as the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes. When we're dealing with gains, we tend to be risk-averse. For example, most of us would prefer a sure gain of $900 over a 90% chance of winning $1,000. But when we're faced with losses, we become risk-seeking. Most people would rather take a 90% chance of losing $1,000 than accept a certain loss of $900. Prospect theory shows that the way a choice is framed, as a potential gain or a potential loss, can dramatically change our decision. The locus of control theory. You've probably noticed that people have very different ways of looking at their lives and the events that happen to them. Some people feel like they are the captains of their own ships, while others feel like they're just being tossed around by the waves. This is the core idea behind the locus of control theory, a concept developed by psychologist Julian Rotter in the 1950s. Locus of control refers to the degree to which you believe you have control over the outcomes of events in your life. It's not a black and white issue, but rather a spectrum. On one end, you have an internal locus of control. If you have a strong internal locus of control, you believe that your own actions, abilities, and efforts are the primary determinants of what happens to you. For example, if you get a good grade on a test, you'll attribute it to your hard work and studying. If you fail, you'll take responsibility and figure out what you need to do differently next time. People with a more internal locus of control tend to be more independent, work harder to achieve their goals, and feel more confident when faced with challenges. On the other end of the spectrum is an external locus of control. If you have a strong external locus of control, you believe that your life is controlled by outside forces that you can't influence, such as luck, fate, or other people. So, if you do well on a test, you might say it was because the test was easy or you got lucky. If you fail, you might blame the teacher or say the questions were unfair. People with a more external locus of control may often feel powerless or hopeless in difficult situations and may not believe their efforts can change their circumstances. It's important to remember that this isn't a fixed personality trait. Your locus of control can shift depending on the situation. While an internal locus of control is often associated with greater success and happiness, there can be times when an external perspective is helpful, especially in situations that are genuinely outside of our control. Understanding your own locus of control can give you insight into how you approach challenges and motivate yourself. Mirror neuron theory. You've probably found yourself wincing when you see someone else get a paper cut, or feel a shadow of the joy on a friend's face as they share good news. There's a fascinating neurological basis for this shared experience: mirror neurons. These are a special type of brain cell that fires both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that same action. In a sense, your brain mirrors the other person's experience. This discovery happened by accident in the early 1990s, when a team of Italian neuroscientists was studying the brains of macaque monkeys. They noticed that certain neurons in the monkey's premotor cortex would become active not only when a monkey grasped an object, but also when it simply watched a researcher grasp that same object. It was as if the monkey's brain was simulating the action it was seeing. While we can't study individual neurons in humans in the same way, brain imaging studies have shown that we have similar mirror systems in our brains. So, what do these mirror neurons do for us? One of their most important roles is in learning through imitation. When you watch someone tie their shoelaces or swing a golf club, your mirror neurons fire as if you were doing it yourself, helping you understand and eventually replicate the action. This is fundamental to how we learn everything from language to complex social behaviors. Perhaps the most profound function of mirror neurons is their proposed role in empathy. They may be the reason we can intuitively understand what others are feeling. When you see someone smile, your mirror neurons for smiling can fire, allowing you to access a hint of that same feeling of happiness. This neural mechanism provides a direct, internal simulation of another person's experience, bridging the gap between you and them. It's a powerful reminder of how deeply we are wired for social connection. Dual process theory, System 1 and System 2 thinking. You can think of your mind as having two different ways of operating, a concept popularized by psychologist Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking, Fast and Slow. He calls them System 1 and System 2. They aren't literal parts of your brain, but rather a way to describe two distinct modes of thought. System 1 is your fast, automatic, and intuitive thinking. It operates with little to no effort and without a sense of voluntary control. This is the system that kicks in when you recognize a friend's face, complete the phrase, salt and, or get a gut feeling about a situation. System 1 is constantly running in the background, making quick judgments and decisions based on past experiences and mental shortcuts called heuristics. It's incredibly efficient and allows us to navigate the world without having to consciously analyze every single piece of information we encounter. System 2, on the other hand, is your slow, deliberate, and logical thinking. It requires effort, attention, and concentration. This is the system you engage when you're solving a complex math problem, comparing two different insurance plans, or trying to park in a tight space. System 2 is the voice of reason. It's capable of complex calculations and can follow rules and weigh pros and cons. The two systems generally work together quite well. System 1 provides the initial impressions, intuitions, and suggestions, and System 2 steps in to endorse, correct, or override them when things get more difficult or when System 1's quick take is likely to be wrong. However, System 2 can be lazy and often just defaults to the easier path of accepting what System 1 suggests. This is where cognitive biases come from. They are the predictable mistakes that System 1 makes in certain situations, and which System 2 fails to catch. Understanding this dual process model can help us recognize our own mental shortcuts and know when it's time to slow down and engage in more careful, deliberate thought. Freud's psychodynamic theory. You've almost certainly heard of Sigmund Freud, and his ideas, while controversial, have had a massive impact on our understanding of the mind. At the core of his psychodynamic theory is the idea that our behavior is driven by psychological processes that happen outside of our conscious awareness. He argued that our childhood experiences are crucial in shaping our adult personality. Freud proposed a structural model of the mind with three interacting parts: the ID, the ego, and the superego. The ID is the most primitive part, present from birth. It's entirely unconscious and operates on the pleasure principle, seeking immediate gratification for all our primal urges, like hunger, thirst, and sex. As we grow and interact with the world, the ego develops. The ego is the decision-making part of our personality that operates on the reality principle. Its job is to mediate the demands of the unrealistic ID with the constraints of the real world. The ego tries to satisfy the ID's desires in a way that is socially acceptable and won't lead to negative consequences. Finally, there's the superego, which is essentially our conscience. It's our internal moral compass, formed from the social rules and values we learn from our parents and society. The superego tells us what's right and wrong and pushes us toward perfection. According to Freud, these three parts are in constant conflict. The ID wants pleasure, the superego wants morality, and the ego is stuck in the middle, trying to keep the peace. When this conflict creates too much anxiety, the ego employs unconscious protective strategies called defense mechanisms. These might include things like denial, where you refuse to accept a painful reality, or projection, where you attribute your own unacceptable feelings to someone else. Freud believed that by bringing these unconscious conflicts and defense mechanisms into our conscious awareness, often through talk therapy, we can better understand ourselves and resolve psychological distress. Jung's archetypes and the collective unconscious. You know how certain stories, characters, and symbols seem to appear in myths and fairy tales all over the world, even in cultures that had no contact with each other. Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist who was once a colleague of Freud, had a theory about that. He believed that underneath our personal unconscious, which is unique to each of us, there is a deeper layer he called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious, in Jung's view, is a kind of shared reservoir of memories and experiences that is common to all of humanity. It's not made up of personal memories, but rather of inherited patterns of thought and universal themes that have been passed down through generations. He believed we are all born with this innate blueprint that shapes how we experience the world. The content of this collective unconscious is expressed through what Jung called archetypes. Archetypes are universal, inborn models of people, behaviors, or personalities that play a role in influencing our behavior. They are like psychological instincts, innate tendencies to think and feel in certain ways. Some of the most well-known archetypes include the hero, who overcomes challenges, the mother, who is a nurturing figure, the wise old man, who acts as a mentor, and the shadow, which represents the darker, hidden aspects of our own personality. Jung identified many archetypes, such as the ruler, the jester, the lover, and the rebel, each representing a fundamental human motif. He believed these archetypes show up in our dreams, art, and religion. According to Jung, the goal of a healthy psychological life is a process called individuation, where we integrate these various archetypal aspects of ourselves, both conscious and unconscious, into a whole and balanced self. By understanding these universal symbols, we can gain a deeper understanding not just of ourselves, but of the shared human experience. The Yerkes-Dodson Law. You've probably noticed that you perform better on a task when you're a little bit energized or even slightly nervous. For example, a bit of anxiety before an exam can help you focus, but too much can make it hard to concentrate. This relationship between your level of arousal and your performance is described by the Yerkes-Dodson Law. First described by psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson in 1908, the law states that your performance increases with physiological or mental arousal, but only up to a certain point. When your arousal level becomes too high, your performance starts to decline. This relationship is often illustrated as an inverted U-shaped curve. At the low end of the curve, when your arousal is too low, you might feel bored or unmotivated, leading to poor performance. As your arousal increases, you become more alert and focused, and your performance improves, moving up the curve. There's an optimal level of arousal, at the very peak of the curve, where you can achieve your best performance. But if the arousal continues to increase beyond that point, if you become too stressed or anxious, your performance will start to suffer. An important part of the Yerkes-Dodson Law is that the optimal level of arousal depends on the complexity of the task. For simple or well-learned tasks, you might perform better with a higher level of arousal to keep you motivated. However, for complex, unfamiliar, or intellectually demanding tasks, a lower level of arousal is better because too much stress can interfere with your concentration and cognitive abilities. This law is a useful way to understand why managing your stress levels is so important for achieving peak performance in different areas of your life. Terror management theory. You've probably never thought of it this way, but a lot of what we do as humans is driven by a deep, underlying awareness that we are all going to die someday. This is the central idea behind terror management theory, or TMT. Developed in the 1980s by psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pyszczynski, the theory is based on the work of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. The core idea is that we are caught in a fundamental psychological conflict. On one hand, we have a powerful instinct for self-preservation, and on the other, we have the advanced intelligence to understand that our death is inevitable and unpredictable. This conflict creates a potential for overwhelming terror, and according to the theory, we've developed a sophisticated defense system to manage it. We don't live in a constant state of existential dread because we have constructed and embraced cultural worldviews. These are the shared beliefs, values, and traditions of our society, things like religion, nationality, and political ideologies. These worldviews give us a sense of meaning, order, and permanence in a world that can seem chaotic and finite. They offer us a path to what the theory calls symbolic immortality. We know our physical bodies won't last forever, but we can feel like a part of us will live on through our contributions to something larger and more enduring, like our family, our country, or our faith. The other key component of this terror management system is self-esteem. Self-esteem, in this context, is the feeling that you are a valuable contributor to a meaningful world. By living up to the standards and values of your culture, you earn a sense of personal worth, which helps to buffer the anxiety that comes with thoughts of mortality. You can see this theory play out in many ways. When we are reminded of our own mortality, a concept called mortality salience, we tend to cling more tightly to our cultural beliefs and show more hostility toward those with different views. It also helps explain our fascination with celebrity culture, as famous individuals often represent the pinnacle of cultural values and achieve a kind of symbolic immortality. Terror management theory offers a compelling, if sometimes unsettling, explanation for why we are so driven to defend our beliefs, seek self-worth, and build legacies that will outlast us. The broken window theory. You've likely walked through a neighborhood and gotten a vibe from it. A place with well-kept homes and clean streets feels safe, while an area with graffiti, litter, and abandoned buildings can feel unsettling. This intuition is at the heart of the broken window theory. First introduced in a 1982 article by social scientists James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, the theory uses a broken window as a metaphor for disorder in a community. The idea is that if a single broken window on a building is left unrepaired, it sends a signal that no one cares, and soon, all the other windows will be broken as well. The theory suggests that these visible signs of disorder, things like vandalism, loitering, and public drinking, create an environment that encourages more serious crime. When residents see these minor infractions go unchallenged, it creates fear and a sense that the area is unsafe. Law-abiding citizens may start to withdraw from public spaces, weakening the informal social controls that would normally keep bad behavior in check. This creates a downward spiral. Minor disorder leads to fear, which leads to community breakdown, which then invites more serious criminal activity. This theory had a huge impact on policing, most famously in New York City in the 1990s under Mayor Rudy Giuliani and Police Commissioner William Bratton. They implemented a zero-tolerance, or quality-of-life, initiative, aggressively cracking down on minor offenses like fare evasion, panhandling, and graffiti. During this time, the city saw a dramatic drop in serious crime, which supporters credited to this broken windows approach. However, the broken window theory is also highly controversial. Many critics argue that the link between disorder and serious crime is a correlation, not a direct cause, and that both are symptoms of deeper social and economic issues like poverty and unemployment. Research has also failed to find convincing long-term evidence for the sequence of events the theory proposes. Furthermore, the zero-tolerance policies it inspired have been criticized for leading to aggressive over-policing, particularly in minority and low-income communities, which can damage the relationship between the police and the public. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're likely familiar with the image of a pyramid used to describe human motivation. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a theory proposed by psychologist Abraham Maslow in 1943. His idea was to understand what drives human behavior, and he suggested that we are motivated to fulfill a series of needs in a specific order, starting with the most basic. It's a theory that focuses not on what goes wrong with people, but on our potential for growth and fulfillment. At the very bottom of the pyramid are our physiological needs. These are the most essential things we need for survival: food, water, shelter, rest, and warmth. Maslow argued that if you are struggling to meet these basic needs, it's hard to focus on anything else. Once your physiological needs are reasonably met, you can move up to the next level: safety needs. This isn't just about physical safety from violence or accidents, it also includes health security, financial stability, and a sense of order and predictability in your life. With a foundation of physical and financial security, you then start to seek out love and belonging needs. As social creatures, we have a deep-seated need for human connection. This includes friendships, family bonds, romantic relationships, and feeling like you are part of a group or community. After you feel a sense of belonging, you can focus on esteem needs. Maslow split this level into two parts: the need for esteem from others, like recognition, status, and respect, and the need for self-esteem, which includes self-confidence, independence, and a sense of personal achievement. When these needs are met, you feel confident and see your contributions as valuable. Finally, at the very peak of the pyramid is self-actualization. Maslow described this as the desire to become everything you are capable of becoming, to fulfill your unique potential. This is a growth need, meaning that unlike the lower, deficiency needs, it's not about a lack of something, but about a drive for personal growth. For one person, self-actualization might mean being an ideal parent; for another, it could be expressed through art, athletics, or inventions. Maslow believed that self-actualizing people are self-aware, less concerned with the opinions of others, and focused on fulfilling their potential. The Mandela Effect. You've probably experienced this. You're absolutely certain you remember a detail from a movie or a historical event, only to find out your memory is wrong. And stranger still, you find out that thousands of other people share your exact same false memory. This is the Mandela Effect. The term was coined by a paranormal researcher named Fiona Broom when she discovered that she and many others shared a vivid memory of Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. Of course, that's not what happened. Mandela was released from prison in 1990, became president of South Africa, and passed away in 2013. This phenomenon of collective false memory is surprisingly common. One of the most famous examples comes from the movie Star Wars, Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. Many people are convinced they heard Darth Vader say, "Luke, I am your father." But the actual line is, "No, I am your father." Another popular one involves the children's book series, The Berenstain Bears. A large number of people distinctly remember the name being spelled Berenstein. So, what's going on here? While some people have fun with theories about alternate universes, the psychological explanations are a bit more down to earth. Our memories are not like video recordings. They are reconstructive, meaning our brains often fill in the gaps with information that seems plausible. This process can lead to the creation of false memories that feel incredibly real. Sometimes, if we hear a misquoted line enough times, that version becomes more familiar to us than the real one. Our brains can also be influenced by suggestibility. If others confidently state a false memory, it can actually alter our own recollection of the event. The internet has likely amplified this effect, as false information can spread rapidly and reinforce these collective misrememberings on a massive scale. The butterfly effect. You've likely heard the phrase, the butterfly effect, often used to describe how a small, seemingly insignificant event can have massive, unforeseen consequences. The idea is that a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world could, in theory, set off a chain of events that ultimately leads to a tornado on the other side of the planet. This isn't to say the butterfly creates the tornado, but that its tiny action introduces a change into a complex system that can lead to a drastically different outcome. This concept comes from chaos theory and was popularized by a meteorologist named Edward Lorenz in the 1960s. He was running a computerized weather model and, to save time, he rounded off one of the initial conditions from 0.506127 to 0.506. This minuscule change, less than 1 part in 1,000, resulted in a completely different long-term weather forecast in his simulation. This demonstrated that in complex, dynamic systems like weather, there is a sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Because it's impossible to know all the initial conditions of a system with perfect accuracy, long-term prediction becomes impossible. While its scientific roots are in weather prediction, the butterfly effect has become a powerful metaphor in popular culture for understanding how our lives and history are shaped by seemingly random, small events. Think about it in your own life. A chance encounter at a coffee shop could lead to a job offer that changes your entire career path. Historically, you can find many examples. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which triggered World War I, was the result of a series of small, coincidental events, including his driver making a wrong turn. A single on-air gaffe by an East German politician in 1989, mistakenly announcing immediate travel policy changes, led to the spontaneous fall of the Berlin Wall that very night. The butterfly effect is a reminder that even our smallest actions can have ripple effects that are impossible to predict. The Barnum Effect, Forer Effect. You've probably read a horoscope or taken an online personality quiz and been amazed at how accurately it described you. This feeling of being perfectly understood by a generalized statement is a cognitive bias known as the Barnum Effect, or the Forer Effect. The name, Barnum Effect, was coined in the 1950s by psychologist Paul Meehl, referencing the famous showman P.T. Barnum, who was known for making his audiences feel like he was speaking directly to them with broad statements. The effect was first demonstrated in a classic experiment in 1948 by psychologist Bertram Forer. He gave a personality test to his students, and a week later, he provided each of them with what they believed was a unique personality analysis based on their results. He then asked them to rate the accuracy of the analysis on a scale of 0 to 5. The students gave it an average rating of 4.3 out of 5, finding it to be highly accurate. The twist? Every single student had received the exact same personality sketch, which Forer had pieced together from a newsstand astrology book. The statements Forer used were intentionally vague and generally applicable to most people, such as, you have a great need for other people to like and admire you, and, at times you are extroverted, affable, sociable, while at other times you are introverted, wary, reserved. This is why things like astrology and fortune-telling can seem so convincing. We have a natural tendency to accept vague statements and find personal meaning in them, a phenomenon known as subjective validation. This effect is particularly strong when the statements are positive, as we are more likely to absorb and agree with flattering descriptions of ourselves. Stockholm Syndrome. You might find it hard to imagine, but in some hostage situations, the captives can develop a psychological bond with their captors, showing sympathy and even loyalty towards them. This counterintuitive response is known as Stockholm Syndrome. The term was coined after a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1973. During a 6-day standoff, 4 bank employees were held hostage in a vault. In a surprising turn of events, the hostages became more fearful of the police than of their captors. After they were freed, some of them defended the bank robbers, refused to testify against them, and even helped raise money for their legal defense. Stockholm Syndrome is not a formal mental health diagnosis but is considered a psychological coping mechanism for survival. It's a response to the intense trauma of being held captive. The positive feelings toward the abuser are thought to be an unconscious way for the victim to cope with the overwhelming fear and helplessness of the situation. By forming a bond with the captor, the victim may reduce the perception of threat and increase their chances of survival. While it's most famously associated with hostage situations, this type of trauma bonding can occur in other abusive contexts as well, such as in cases of domestic violence, child abuse, and human trafficking. Researchers believe a few conditions make the syndrome more likely to develop. The crisis must last for a significant period of time, the hostages must be in close contact with their captors, and the captors must show some degree of kindness or at least refrain from harming the victims. It's a relatively rare phenomenon, with the FBI estimating that it affects fewer than 8% of kidnapping victims. The Meinhof phenomenon, frequency illusion. You've surely experienced this. You learn a new word or hear about a new car model, and then suddenly, you start seeing it everywhere. This is the Meinhof phenomenon, more formally known as the frequency illusion. It's the feeling that something you recently became aware of is suddenly happening or appearing with an unusually high frequency. The name, Meinhof phenomenon, originated in 1994 when a reader of a newspaper wrote in about his experience of hearing about the German militant group, the Meinhof gang, and then immediately encountering the name again. This led to others sharing similar stories, and the name stuck. The more scientific term, frequency illusion, was coined by a Stanford linguistics professor in 2005. This phenomenon is the result of 2 cognitive processes working together. The first is selective attention. When you learn about something new, your brain is primed to notice it. It's not that the word or car is actually appearing more often, it's that your brain is now subconsciously on the lookout for it, so you notice it when you would have previously overlooked it. The second process is confirmation bias. Once you start noticing this thing more often, your brain takes it as proof that your perception of increased frequency is real. Each new sighting confirms your belief, strengthening the illusion. So, when you buy a new car and suddenly see the same model everywhere, it's not a coincidence, it's just your brain's pattern-seeking and confirmation tendencies at work. The sunk cost fallacy. You've almost certainly fallen for the sunk cost fallacy, even if you didn't know its name. It's the tendency to continue with an endeavor not because it's the best decision for your future, but because you've already invested time, money, or effort that you can't get back. We have a hard time letting go of these sunk costs, so we make irrational decisions to try and justify our past investments. Think about it in everyday life. You're halfway through a movie you're not enjoying. A rational decision would be to stop watching and do something else with your time. But the sunk cost fallacy kicks in, and you think, well, I've already invested an hour, I might as well finish it. The same goes for forcing yourself to finish a meal you don't like simply because you paid for it, or continuing to read a boring book just because you're already 100 pages in. This bias can have much bigger consequences. In relationships, a person might stay with a partner they're unhappy with because they've already spent years together and don't want all that time to be wasted. In business, this is a classic trap. A company might keep pouring money into a failing project because they've already invested millions, even when all signs point to it being a bad idea. A famous real-world example is the Concorde supersonic jet. The British and French governments continued to fund the project for years, despite overwhelming evidence that it would never be commercially viable. Their justification was often that they had already spent too much to stop. The reason we do this is partly psychological, we're wired to avoid losses. Admitting that a past investment was a waste feels like accepting a loss, which is more painful than the potential gain from moving on. To avoid this fallacy, the key is to focus on future costs and benefits rather than past investments. The money, time, or effort is already gone, so the only rational thing to do is make the best choice based on where you are right now. The paradox of choice. You probably think that having more choices is always a good thing. The freedom to choose is a core value in many societies, and we tend to believe that the more options we have, the better our chances of finding the perfect one. But psychologist Barry Schwartz argues that's not always the case. In his 2004 book, The Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less, he makes the case that an overwhelming number of options can actually lead to paralysis rather than liberation. When faced with too many choices, a few negative things can happen. First, you can experience decision paralysis. The sheer volume of options can be so daunting that you end up not making a choice at all because the effort of weighing every possibility is just too much. Think about standing in the grocery store aisle trying to pick a jam from dozens of varieties, or scrolling endlessly through a streaming service, unable to decide on a movie to watch. Second, even if you do manage to make a choice, you're often less satisfied with it than if you had fewer options. This is because of something called opportunity cost. When you have many alternatives, it's easy to imagine the attractive features of the options you didn't choose. This can lead to regret and a feeling that you might have made the wrong decision. Finally, an abundance of choice can lead to an escalation of expectations. With so many options available, you start to believe that one of them must be absolutely perfect. This makes you more likely to be disappointed with the choice you eventually make, even if it's a good one. Schwartz distinguishes between two types of decision makers: maximizers, who try to find the absolute best option, and satisficers, who are happy to settle for an option that is good enough. Maximizers tend to experience more stress and regret in a world of endless choice. The key takeaway is that while some choice is good, more is not always better. The Zeigarnik Effect. You've probably noticed that the tasks you've left unfinished tend to pop into your head more often than the ones you've completed. That nagging feeling that you need to finish that email or complete that report is a psychological phenomenon known as the Zeigarnik Effect. It's the tendency to remember incomplete or interrupted tasks better than completed ones. The effect is named after Bluma Zeigarnik, a Soviet psychologist who first studied it in the 1920s. The story goes that she observed waiters in a restaurant who could remember complex, unpaid orders perfectly but would forget the details as soon as the bill was paid. This sparked her curiosity, and she conducted a series of experiments to test this observation. She had participants perform a series of simple tasks, like solving puzzles or stringing beads. She interrupted them during some of the tasks but allowed them to complete others. Later, she found that the participants were about twice as likely to remember the tasks they had been interrupted on. The psychological explanation for this is that when you start a task, your brain creates a specific tension related to that task. This tension keeps the task at the forefront of your memory. Once the task is completed, the tension is released, and your brain is free to let go of the information. But if the task is left unfinished, the tension remains, causing the thoughts about it to intrude on your consciousness. This effect is used all the time in media and marketing. The cliffhanger at the end of a TV show episode is a perfect example of the Zeigarnik Effect in action. The unresolved story creates a mental tension that makes you want to tune in next week to relieve it. In user experience design, you'll see it in things like profile completion meters on social media sites. That "your profile is 80% complete" message creates an unresolved feeling that encourages you to finish the task. The Spotlight Effect. You've probably had a moment of intense self-consciousness where you felt like everyone was staring at you. Maybe you tripped in a crowded hallway or wore a t-shirt you thought was embarrassing. In that moment, it can feel like a giant spotlight is shining on you and your every move is being scrutinized. This tendency to overestimate how much other people notice our appearance or actions is a cognitive bias called the spotlight effect. The reality is, people are not paying nearly as much attention to us as we think they are. We are the center of our own universe, and because we are so focused on ourselves, it's hard to imagine that others aren't just as focused on us. This effect was demonstrated in a clever study where college students were asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt, one with a large picture of the singer Barry Manilow on it, and then enter a room full of other students. Afterwards, the students who wore the shirt were asked to estimate how many people in the room had noticed who was on their shirt. They consistently and significantly overestimated the number. In reality, far fewer people had noticed than the wearer of the shirt believed. The researchers suggest this happens because of a process called anchoring and adjustment. We anchor on our own intense experience of an event and then try to adjust for other people's perspectives. The problem is, we don't adjust enough. The spotlight effect isn't limited to embarrassing moments. We also tend to overestimate how much our positive contributions are noticed in a group setting. It's a useful bias to be aware of, as it can help reduce feelings of social anxiety and self-consciousness by reminding us that most people are more wrapped up in their own lives than they are in ours. The just world hypothesis. You might find it comforting to believe that the world is a fair place where people generally get what they deserve. This is the core of the just world hypothesis, a cognitive bias where we have a tendency to believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. The theory was first developed by social psychologist Melvin Lerner in the 1960s. This belief can be a helpful coping mechanism. It can make the world seem more predictable and controllable, and it can motivate us to work towards our goals with the expectation that our efforts will be justly rewarded. A person working 2 jobs to provide for their family might feel more hopeful if they believe their hard work will ultimately lead to a better life. However, this belief has a significant dark side. When we see something bad happen to someone, our need to see the world as fair can lead us to rationalize the event in a way that blames the victim. If we can convince ourselves that the victim must have done something to deserve their misfortune, we can preserve our belief in a just world and feel safer from similar random tragedies ourselves. Lerner first demonstrated this in a study where participants watched someone receive what they thought were painful electric shocks for answering questions incorrectly. He found that if the observers couldn't do anything to stop the suffering, they would start to think poorly of the person receiving the shocks, essentially deciding that the person must have deserved it. This bias can lead to harmful attitudes in the real world, such as blaming the poor for their poverty, or blaming victims of assault for their own suffering, instead of acknowledging the complex external factors at play. It's a powerful reminder of how our need for a sense of order can sometimes lead us to unjust conclusions. The anchoring effect. You've almost certainly been influenced by the anchoring effect without even realizing it. It's a cognitive bias that makes us rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, the anchor, when making decisions. Once that anchor is set, all our subsequent judgments and estimates are made by adjusting away from it, which means that first number has a powerful pull on our final conclusion. A classic experiment by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman perfectly illustrates this. They spun a wheel of fortune with numbers from 0 to 100, but it was rigged to only land on 10 or 65. After the wheel spun, they asked participants 2 questions. Is the percentage of African nations in the United Nations greater or less than the number you just saw, and what is your best estimate of that percentage? The participants who saw the wheel land on 10 guessed, on average, that the percentage was 25%. Those who saw the number 65 guessed an average of 45%. The completely random number from the wheel acted as an anchor, powerfully influencing their estimates. You see the anchoring effect everywhere, especially in negotiations and marketing. When you're buying a car, the initial price the dealer puts on the windshield is the anchor. Every price below that seems more reasonable, even if it's still higher than the car's actual value. Similarly, when you see a t-shirt that's priced at $50 but is on sale for $30, the original price of $50 acts as an anchor, making the sale price seem like a great deal. If that same t-shirt had been originally priced at $30, you'd perceive its value very differently. It's also used in salary negotiations. The first person to name a number sets the anchor for the rest of the conversation. This is why it's often advised to make the first offer if you've done your research. Even when an anchor is obviously wrong or irrelevant, it can still be surprisingly effective. Studies have shown that even when people are explicitly told that an anchor is random, it can still influence their judgment. Being aware of this bias is the first step in trying to avoid it. You can counter its effects by actively considering other possible starting points and gathering more information before making a final decision. The framing effect. The way information is presented to you can dramatically influence your decisions, even when the underlying facts are exactly the same. This is the framing effect. It's a cognitive bias where we react differently to a particular choice depending on whether it's presented as a loss or a gain. A famous study by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman illustrates this perfectly. They presented a group of doctors with a hypothetical scenario about an outbreak of a deadly disease that was expected to kill 600 people. They were given two options for a program to combat the disease. The first group was presented with positively framed options. If they chose Program A, 200 people would be saved. If they chose Program B, there was a 1/3 probability that 600 people would be saved and a 2/3 probability that no one would be saved. A vast majority of this group, 72%, chose the certain outcome of Program A. The second group of doctors was given the exact same options, but they were framed in a negative, or loss-averse, way. They were told that if they chose Program C, 400 people would die. If they chose Program D, there was a 1/3 probability that nobody would die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people would die. Notice that Program A and C are identical outcomes, as are Programs B and D. But in this group, 78% chose Program D, the riskier option. The study showed that when the choice was framed as a gain, saving lives, people were risk-averse, they preferred the sure thing. But when it was framed as a loss, people dying, they became risk-seeking, willing to gamble to avoid the certain loss. You see this in marketing and advertising all the time. A package of ground beef labeled 80% lean sounds much more appealing than one labeled 20% fat, even though they are the exact same product. In politics, a tax relief is framed to sound like the removal of a burden, making it more popular than a tax cut, which sounds more neutral. The framing effect is a powerful reminder that the context and language used to present information can be just as important as the information itself. The availability heuristic. You're constantly making judgments and decisions based on the information that's most easily available in your mind. This mental shortcut is known as the availability heuristic. It's a cognitive bias where you judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily you can recall examples of it. The more vivid or recent a memory is, the more probable we think the event is. This shortcut works well most of the time because events that happen more frequently are generally easier to remember. However, it can lead to predictable errors in judgment because our memories are often influenced by factors other than frequency. For example, if you were asked whether there are more words in the English language that start with the letter K or have K as the third letter, most people would say there are more words that start with K. This is because it's much easier for our brains to search for words by their first letter. In reality, there are about 3 times as many words with K as the third letter. The availability heuristic is heavily influenced by media coverage. Sensational and dramatic events, like shark attacks or airplane crashes, are widely reported and stick in our minds. This makes us overestimate the probability of these rare events while underestimating the risk of more common but less memorable dangers, like heart disease or car accidents. Similarly, a doctor who has recently diagnosed a rare disease might be more likely to see it in other patients with similar symptoms, because that recent diagnosis is more available in their memory. The availability heuristic shows that our perception of reality isn't always based on facts and statistics, but on how easily things come to mind. The hindsight bias. After an event has happened, it's easy to look back and feel like you knew what was going to happen all along. This is the hindsight bias, also known as the "I knew it all along" phenomenon. It's a cognitive bias that makes us perceive past events as having been more predictable than they actually were. This bias can distort our memory of what we truly thought before the event occurred and lead to overconfidence in our ability to predict future events. Think about a major sporting event. Before the game, you might be unsure of the outcome. But after your team wins, you might say, "I knew they were going to win the whole time." In reality, you probably considered many possible scenarios, but once the outcome is known, your mind selectively recalls the information that confirms that outcome. This makes the event seem inevitable in retrospect. The hindsight bias is particularly common when the outcome of an event is negative. For example, after a stock market crash, financial analysts might appear on the news and confidently explain why the crash was obviously going to happen, pointing to all the warning signs. However, these same experts likely did not predict the crash with such certainty beforehand. This bias can have significant negative consequences. In legal settings, it can lead jurors to believe that a negative outcome, like a medical malpractice case, should have been foreseen and prevented, even if the situation was highly uncertain at the time. It can also make it harder to learn from our mistakes. If we believe that a bad outcome was inevitable, we're less likely to analyze the decisions that led to it and identify what could have been done differently. By being aware of the hindsight bias, we can try to be more objective when evaluating past decisions. The gambler's fallacy. You've probably seen it in a movie or maybe even felt it yourself at a casino. A roulette wheel has landed on black 10 times in a row, so a gambler confidently places a huge bet on red, thinking it's due to come up. This is the gambler's fallacy, also known as the Monte Carlo fallacy. It's the mistaken belief that if a random event has happened more frequently than normal in the past, it's less likely to happen in the future, or vice versa. This line of thinking comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of probability. In reality, for independent events like a coin flip or a spin of a fair roulette wheel, past outcomes have absolutely no influence on future ones. The probability of a coin landing on heads is always 50%, no matter if the last 10 flips were all tails. Each flip is a fresh start. The most famous real-world example of this fallacy happened at the Monte Carlo Casino in 1913. The ball in a game of roulette landed on black 26 times in a row. As the streak continued, players lost millions of francs by betting against black, assuming that a red was long overdue. The gambler's fallacy isn't just limited to gambling. An investor might sell a stock after a long period of gains, incorrectly believing that a downturn is now more likely. Or, a loan officer might be more likely to approve a loan application if they have just rejected several in a row, feeling that a qualified applicant is due. The key to avoiding this fallacy is to remember that in a sequence of independent random events, the odds don't reset or try to balance themselves out. The universe doesn't have a memory.